So this is your pattern for your Tudor bodice for the sleeve block. It's a modern block. It's very simple. If you look at your sleeve, the way you find out where the front and back is if you fold it in half, and you can see just here, I draw, you can see that it's slightly bigger that side than this side. The bigger side of the sleeve head is the back, and the more shallower in the front is for the front. So it gives you a little bit more room on your shoulder. So figure out which side you've got, because you're only making one. So do the correct side. For if you do the right side, make sure you're doing the right side sleeve and not the left, because it'll be too tight around the back of the arm if you do it backwards. So once you've established that, put a and then you're gonna, on your seam allowance, say this is your seam allowance in between here, you're gonna do 2 gathering stitches on a number 5 stitch, so either side of the seam allowance line. So from about here all the way around to about here. Don't do under the arm. And again on the bottom, do 2 lines. Number 5, gather the top one up, leave the bottom one for now. And then what you'll do is, with your front of your garment, this is the front, you're gonna leave opening for the cuff, for the placket on the cuff. And if you stitch, this is your seam line, the pink, if you stitch about 1/4 inch into the seam allowance for your first stitch and stitch down to that point of the placket. Then what I do is clip to the green stitch line, and I turn this back, oops, it's a little bit tiny, fold them back on themselves, and machine down either side. And then what happens, you fold it back inside. So you're creating a French seam, so you've turned it back to the inside and you've stitched along the original seam allowance line, but go 1 inch past where your clip mark was there. Yeah, and then pop it back to the front. Make sure there's nothing peeping out here. And then you can see your little placket, so depending on what side you want it to be. Fold the top one under and leave the under one straight. So it's all encased, there's no raw edges. You'll have a slight bit opening there from where you clipped it. You've turned it in, but it's encased inside there. And then, if you haven't already gathered up your wrists gathered up, and it's ready to pop your cuff onto it. So you've prepped your placket, so you decide now whether you want your placket, you want an actual placket, one over the other, or in my case, I'm going to just iron them both back because I'm going to do my cuff just flush and have a little tie. So I pressed both of them under. I put a pin where my center line is on the gathering, and I've gathered it up to 7.5 inches. So the average wrist size is 7 to 7.5. So I'm doing mine at 7, and I'm leaving 1/2 inch for some ease, so it's not too tight on the wrist. So my cuff, I'm doing it inch deep. And because this fabric is quite see-through, I've done it an inch front, inch back, and I folded it back up, not quite an inch on either side. I've left a gap in between, so that way it's a little bit more, it'll block out all this gathering. So make sure you leave a bit of a gap there, because when you come to turn it up, you don't want this fabric folding over on itself. So I've left a gap, so that's about 2, 3 3/4 inches, the whole width of it. And it's about 8.5 inches long. I've done a 1/2 inch seam allowance on either end. And then I'll turn my sleeve over. I've also put a crease in the cuff just there, so I know where the center is. So if you were having a placket, you would add your placket to this, and when you're finding the center, you wouldn't include that under placket in figuring out where the center of your sleeve is. So I've turned it over. I press these down a little bit to condense them so they're not so fluffy. And I'm opening up the one side, and I'm going to pin it to the center there. And I'm pinning there, the ends. Just pinning it all in place roughly. Check it. So I need to tweak it because you can see my lines are a little bit wobbly. But what I would do then, I would come and machine across here. And then I can turn this up and machine down either end and turn it in on itself. So you can see it blocks out the gathering there. So I've machined my cuff on. But I pricked my finger there and I bled a little bit. So a little trick I'll show you. If you bleed on your garment, get some cotton thread, roll it up in a ball and suck on it so you get it all, your saliva on it. And then you just roll it. And the enzymes in your saliva break it down and it comes away. You have to do this right away. It has to be cotton, thread, or even a little bit of another piece of oil would work. And it has to be your own saliva for your own blood. And it brings it right off. There, gone. Little trick for you. Right, so I've machined it on. I'll press it. I'm going to press it up and then I'll machine it on my seam allowance marks where the red dots are. Before you machine the ends, pin your tie in, so pop it along inside, peeping out there, so you can see here where it's peeping out. I'll just pull it in back in a little bit. Make sure they're even. And then machine your ends. So it's machined either end, clip your corners, and then you can bag it out. So here it is, stitched, clipped, your ties are in there, bag it out. I've trimmed that a little bit. And make sure your ties are evenly on either side, and then you can come along and slip stitch that along there. And if your secondary stitch from your gathering stitches is peeping out, you can pull that out. So your cuff, the way I've done it then, you can do it that way, or you can pre-make this cuff so it's all complete and then attach it. But I couldn't do that because I was double folding my fabric back, so hence the reason I did it like that and then sewed it. So depending on what you're using, if you're using this voile, do it like I did. If you're using lawn or linen, you don't need such a deep turn in. You can just leave the edges out raw and pre-make your cuff and then attach it. So I'm going to attach my sleeve, so I need to establish where the top of my shoulder seam is, and I put my French seam at the bottom. I pinned about 3 pins along here so it's smooth under the arm. I've distributed my gathering around the head, so if you look at it, where you want it to be. So that looks all right. It's all concentrated around here. You can have a little slightly bit more at the back of the shoulder, gives you some room. And making sure it's hanging right. I don't want it to be tipped forward or tipped back. I want this to hang nice, so I think that looks fine. So I'm going to turn it in and I'm going to pin my first pin at the center at the top. then I'm gonna, this gap here to where the pins stop here, I'm gonna find, without smoothing out the gathering, distribute it evenly and pin my point there. I'm going to do the same at the back here. So I'm finding this gap here. I've got my gathering and I'll pin it about there. And then I can go between all the other gaps and do the same thing. And then look at it. Am I happy with that? Does it look okay? It's got a nice gathering there to about here. It's hanging nicely. I'm happy. Then I can go on to the next step. So then you turn it into the inside, so your sleeve's going into the armhole here. You've swapped all your pins round to this side. And if you pin them on the inside gathering stitch line and just slightly back at the edge, you can just see the shadow. You can see the edge there. I don't know, maybe 3 millimeters. Just bias bound the outer edge of it. So I pinned it all in place. And I pinned it on the inner gathering stitch line. So I've got access to the outer, and then I'm just going around with bias binding. This is store-bought, but I think it's a bit crispy. If you could, I'd make it out of the fabric, self fabric. So here I pinned my bias binding around. And I've marked with a soluble pen. You can just see here. I've marked at intervals, so I know exactly where it's going to go back. So I'll pop it off now. And I can machine on this bias binding. So that's it stitched on. So I've just folded it over and top stitched it because it's not going to be seen. And it's ready to pop in. This is it machined on. I can come along and pull that secondary stitch out. And then I'll just pop it back in. And then I can match my little dots up. So I can see my next one there. And the next one there. And the next one there. And just work my way around till I'm happy where they are. And then I could just tack it, and it's quickly removed if I want it. If I want to take it out, so just do a little whip stitch around there to hold it in place. And that's attaching your sleeve. And it'll sit in nicely like that. So if it's slightly back of there, it doesn't look like, again, like the front edge here. You don't want it right sewn right to the edge here. It's slightly back, so it looks like it's a real chemise, a whole chemise, and you've just put the bodice on over top of it. So that's inserting your sleeve.